It's okay if I take a kick.
Oh yeah, that's why they're there.
Yeah, and you take as many of those as you want. You'll have to compete with my 252 lab though, because
As many as I want. That's pretty generous.
alrighty. So first order of the day, quiz time. So we didn't have the actual video homework, so this is just from last lecture. Formula for F1 score. Write that down real quick on a piece of paper. And throw your Purdue login on there too. So we have that. And just a quick memory jog. TP is true positive, false positive, true negative, false positive, false negative.
Hello, today we will have more audience here.
Cool.
Okay.
Just doing a quiz right now. Feel free to have a Kit Kat.
Oh, sure. I will be here every week then.
Well, that's the point exactly. Everyone done with the quiz? All right, just throw it all right here. Awesome. Now, can anyone give me the answer?
D, because you have, is it precision over precision plus recall, or is it the other way around?
Nope, this is it. B.
Oh shit, I thought that was something about that application.
Yeah, no, this one is actually accuracy. Just our true positive plus true negative over everything. If you'll remember, 2 times precision, precision times recall over precision plus recall is the harmonic mean of precision and recall. And that is what F1 score turns out to be, which is part of why it's such a good metric. Is it kind of includes it factors in both the precision and the recall of the network. So, quick logistics for today. We are going to have our homework. The slide is actually a lie. I already released it on the website. It's pretty easy. Definitely give it a little bit of time because it's going to do some hand calculation. We'll talk about it a little more at the end, but it's not too bad as far as it goes. Don't worry about it being 10% of the grade. Think of it less like, if you do it and you show your work, I'm going to give you most of the grade. So it's not something to worry about, but as long as you give it a go. Today's subject, we're actually going to get into neural networks, and it should be interesting because some of the stuff is a little bit difficult. I suggest kind of looking over it again after lecture. Maybe look online for other people teaching it too. What I found helped me figure it out was having lots and lots of different ways it's explained from different perspectives. But we're going to try to look at a few different perspectives, and hopefully that'll reinforce some of it. So important terms, you can go back and look at this later, but we're not going to go over them right away. Most of them will be covered in here. So, as far as the inspiration for neural networks goes, they are inspired by biological neurons, but that is it. They aren't the digital version of biological neurons, and they aren't even quite based on them. The way that a biological neuron functions is far, far, far more complicated than a artificial neuron. The artificial neurons are extremely simple comparatively. The biological neurons include all sorts of extra functionality in them, basically. But we'll look a little closer at that. So, biological neuron, anyone who took biology in college, can you tell me any major parts of this that you remember?
Axon, dendrite,
Axon, dendrites.
node of reindeer, where you have to break.
Yep. Well, actually, that's nodes are earlier. Myelin sheath.
Myelin.
Yeah. But the basics here that we're going to be looking at are the dendrites, the nucleus, and the axon. Really, we could call the nucleus just the whole cell body in this, however we wanted to use the metaphor. But the basic idea that we're going to be borrowing from this and taking over to our artificial neural networks are, we have these dendrites where we're taking in information from other neurons. We have our cell body or nucleus that's going to be doing some very simple calculations. And then we are making use of the axon to send out this information to other cells in the network. And again, the one neuron can't do much. Certain insects and such have very few neurons, even then usually it's millions, but they can't compute nearly as effectively as something with billions and billions of these stacked up. And just to kind of get a general idea of this, when we have a network like this, information is going to be flowing from dendrite to axon, dendrite to axon. Now, again, this is major simplification in biological neural nets like your brain. Sometimes there's recurrences and other cells are involved and different types of neurons and all that. But the basic idea is we have this forward information flow. Now, we can talk about our artificial neuron. Much simpler model, and we'll talk a little bit about the different pieces here. And again, we're just looking at the structure first. We'll get into a little more about how we actually use these things later, but for right now, we can think of a neuron as a set of inputs, each with a weight, a summation function, and an activation function. We also have this down here called the bias. Sometimes this won't be shown in a diagram of neural nets. It is usually involved in them though. There are some times when bias isn't used, but most of the time you're going to have this bias in here, which is just another input with its own weight, and that's going to be always statically 1. The weight can change, but the bias will remain 1. The reason for that we'll get into a little more later, but yeah. So when we have this neuron, the way we are going to be running this thing, the way we're going to be using it, is we take all of our inputs, multiply each input by its weight, and then sum that. It's the sum of products of our inputs and weights. Once we have that in there, of course we're doing the same thing with our bias. That gets also brought into the sum once it's already been multiplied by its weight. And we use that as the input to our activation function. And we'll talk more about activation functions in a bit, but the basic idea of them is we are restricting our output, usually restricting the range of our output, or sometimes just mapping our output to different values. It's helping us control what this y is going to be at the end. And then finally, we do have this Y that is like the axon of our neural net, or our single neuron here. And that's just going to be the output. So again, this is a very simple system. It does have some interesting parts, but it's mostly just inputs multiplied by weights, summed, and then input into an activation function. And again, the activation function, when I started looking into these, I always thought that it was kind of the where the magic happened here. It's not anything special either. It's, as far as the calculations go, if anything, the summing of the products is the big part. The activation function is important, but it is simply to control our output a little more concisely. So again, we can talk about it a little closer. We have inputs, weights, our bias. Often that'll be called X0 or sometimes B. W0 is usually the weight for the bias. Simple activation function, f of x or f of a, or a of x, and our y output run by multiplying the inputs by the weights, sum, input the sum the activation function, and y is the output of that function. So a little bit of a closer look just so we can get an idea of what these are. Again, we're restricting our output and mapping it onto a range that we like. We are going to talk much more about these in a later lecture, but here's a few simple ones that we use a lot. Sigmoid. As you can see, we have a nice gentle curve here. All the outputs from this activation function are going to be between 0 and 1, and if the input or if the sum of products happens to be 0, it's going to end up being 0.5. And again, it's this nice gentle curve, which can be helpful in neural nets later, as we'll see. Tan-H, very similar to sigmoid in a lot of ways, except instead of it being between 0 and 1, we have between -1 and 1. Again, we have a very gentle curve, and this time our 0 value is just ending up being 0. This is ReLU. It is a bit of a newer one on the scene. Obviously, the idea of maximum between 0 and x is not new at all, but the idea of using it in a neural net is, it doesn't have some of the nicer qualities, like a nice slope that is consistent all the way through, but what it does have is, when using these in very big neural networks, it can be very efficient. And part of that's just because it's a super easy function computationally. We're not using exponents or multiplication, we're just doing a comparison. But again, commonly used, usually pretty good. A slight variation of ReLU is ELU. This is going to be, whenever it's above 0, it's going to be just the same as our ReLU function. The only difference is when we're less than 0, we're going to be having our e to the x minus 1 as our function multiplied by some constant. In this case, I use 0.5. It'll usually be a smaller number like this. And it makes the slope a little nicer and makes it so we're not just having flat zeros over here. So a negative value will actually then be able to have weight on this function, but it's not going to be this exact scaling powerful thing we have in the positive value range. So another great way to look at neurons, and one that we'll be using a lot later, is seeing them as a function. Right? We've looked at it structurally. We saw it as this kind of inspired by biological neurons look, but we can also look at it as a mathematical function. In this case, we can name it f of x, or f of x1, x2, x3, all of our inputs, and think of just the single neuron as the output of an activation of a sum of xi times yi plus b. So that's just another way of looking at it, and it'll eventually be helpful to start looking at it in that functional way. But,
So,
yep.
just quick. So in this case, you're adding the bias to each weight rather than an overall bias, or?
Yeah, so in this case, this is a bit of a weird way of showing it. You can almost think of it more like, so in this case, when we have the B here, it's not always going to be 1. B is representing basically 1 times the weight of the bias.
Okay.
So weight of the bias at I or whatever.
Yeah, I guess his question is the curly bracket, the curly bracket has to be immediately after WI instead of after B.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I did mess
Yeah.
that up. Yeah, it
Yeah,
should
sure.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the bias should be not into every summation, yeah.
Okay.
Apologies, I latexed all the equations.
But is it like wrong to add it to each weight? Like it can be like different weights can have different bias, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can do it that way, but
Okay.
usually the way to do it usually is you want to have one bias, and that's going to be
Okay.
multiplied by some bias weight. And the reason that is, we'll see a little more closely later on.
Okay.
But basically, it's, remember 250, the transistors, and you could have like a NOT gate can have no input, but then it's going to be sending out an output signal because it's a NOT gate.
Right.
And we can do that because we're powering the circuit still, we have some input. That's kind of like that in a way. You can almost view it as the power to our neuron if all of our inputs are zeroed for whatever reason.
Okay.
So, neuron learning, we are going to, off track there, but, so we're going to define a neuron that is learned as any neuron that has the weights the way we want them to be, because that's baseline what we're changing in all of these cases. We aren't going to be changing the activation function to make this thing learn. We can't change the inputs because that's a function of the inputs. What we can change is the weights. And if we were looking at it in this functional way we were talking about, what we want to do is mimic some greater outside function, external function, whether that be a predictor, where the function would be to take in our prediction data and output what class it should be in. We want to mimic that function the best we can by changing the weights. So we're going to define a learned neuron as one that has got its weight set the right way. So we need to change the weights. But how do we do that? Well, for right now, we introduce the magic wand. The magic wand is a very old machine learning secret. What we do is we poke our neural network with it, and it sets the weights for us. And so we're going to mess with it a little before we start talking about what it is, but let's poke some neural networks. So we have this very simple neuron, just one single neuron, and it has this activation function. It's a simple step function here. If it's positive, it's going to be 1, negative 0. What can we do with this? Well, how about NAND gate? Set the bias to 3, our weights to negative 2. It's always going to come out positive when we want it to and negative when we don't want it to. That's one way of looking at it. Not a common way, to be clear, but that's certainly a way of using these things. I'm on an OR gate. Still works. And as you may remember from computer architecture, those are the universal gates. You stack those up, you have all computing. Now, again, thinking of neurons as just logic gates is restrictive. They're not. They can do so much more than that. But worth remembering that you can use these things however you want. Are these standard ways and these very good ways and helpful ways of using them, but it is a very dynamic framework that you can work with, and you don't be afraid to experiment with them, is what I'm saying. You can be creative with these. Or we can be a little less creative with this one, but still interesting. We can make a classifier, just one single neuron. This is admittedly not very good classifier, but it's going to try to figure out whether a company will succeed given some data. Again, we're using our same activation function, the step thing, and we might have, the company might be in debt. That's going to make things a little harder, but maybe the company has an experienced CEO that might be able to help out with that. Maybe the company has a lot of investors. That could be very good for them. Might even be able to get past the company being in debt. Maybe the company's Enron, and then, probably not going to do so well. In this case, I set the bias to 0 just to kind of show we don't need to use the bias every time. As long as we change the weight of the bias, we can make it be whatever we want it to be. But we have it there. And by the way, and again, to talk about the bias, the reason that something like this works is that we have the bias. We couldn't do this without a bias because we need the use of this consistent constant here. And we can change the weights to make that constant be whatever it is. Basically, if you want to think about this in a very mathematical functional way, you can think of this as like as multiplying constants by variables. Like you could have 3x plus 2y time plus some constant. You can look at it as, in this case, it would be negative 2x plus negative 2x1 plus negative 2x2, or times negative 2x2, all plus a constant 1. But, a lot of ways to look at these, and it's a good way of showing why the bias is necessary. So, let's finally talk about real neural networks, not just one neuron. Just like we can stack up the biological neurons, we can stack up our artificial neurons. In that case, we have our inputs, which for right now we're going to just call them neurons. These are input neurons. They don't have activations, they don't have our summation, they're just outputting the whatever input we gave them. It'd be like x1, x2, x3. Then we can, in this kind of simple model, we have our fully connected layers. Each of these edges represents one single weight that is between our input and our next neuron in the chain here. And you'll notice every neuron from one layer is connected, from the input layer is connected to every neuron of the next layer. This allows the neural net to work with every combination of the inputs and can find patterns that maybe would be harder for a human to find. We have input layer, of course, we talked about. We have the output layer, which again, usually the output layer is going to have the activations and everything. It's just going to be the final output. But then we have these hidden layers, and these are where a lot of the computation is going to be happening. These are just going to be layers inside the network that are usually not exposed outside the network. We're not going to be looking at them very much, except when we're experimenting or doing certain interesting things with them. But in general, when we're just mimicking the function with a neural network, these are hidden, but they're a very valuable part of the computation because they allow us to mix and match our different variables in different ways. I know there's been a lot. Any questions so far? Or? So here's just another little version of one. Tell me what's a major difference between this little neural net, and the one we showed on the last page?
The last one did not have any bias.
Yeah, they didn't show the bias in that last one. Good.
Instead of having every single input go to every single node in the first layer, you kind of grouped it into two different ones that'll converge later.
Yes, very good. And you can do it this way. It's usually not going to be as effective. The cards on the table, the reason I did this is I made it and then I realized that it was wrong. And then I was like, oh, wait. But yeah, in general, we're going to have these would be both going to this hidden layer here. And again, this would be the hidden layer, this would be the input layer, but we would have just two of these each going to both of the neurons instead of having different ones. Now, let's run through one. Anyone want to give it a try? All right, we'll do it one step at a time. Let's start with this neuron. Here's our input. We can multiply it by the weight here. Multiply this one by the weight here. We have 9 plus 20, 29. We put that through ReLU. If you remember, if it's over 0, it's just going to be x, so this is 29. Someone else has to do the next neuron now.
So 10 into minus 1 plus 3 into 1. So
Yep.
minus 7.
Yep. And then that goes through the ReLU function.
Yeah.
What does that end up being?
It becomes 0.
Yeah,
because
0.
zeros are
Yep.
x.
Yep. So we have a zeroed out neuron, and we have a, what did we say for this guy?
It was 29.
29.
29?
29.
Yeah. 29 times 4. I'm not doing that in my head.
116.
What did you say?
116.
Oh, you guys are faster than me. And 0 times negative 2, 0. And then,
116.
yeah, 116 output. Very good. So, yep, that's just our forward propagation. That is, we'll either call that forward propagation or feed forward. And that is the operation that once we have our biases set by thoroughly hitting the neuron over the head with the magic wand, as we talked about, that's how we'll do our predictions or our mimicking of a function or whatever we're doing. So, just by the shape, think outside the box a little on this one. What do you think this is?
Oh, mess.
You're not wrong.
A very intelligent voice.
Think about the shape a little, not as much about, and about where the connections happen, not as much about the neural implications. Ready to give up? Remember, we can use these as NANDs. There's no reason we can't do this. I'm not saying it's useful, especially because we can have an adder with just one neuron just by having all the biases be 1, or all the weights be 1, the bias be 0. But you can do this. It's just another way of looking at it, and a weird one too, which I like.
So is this a half adder?
I think this is a full adder because it has the. Would it be a half adder? I do not remember 250 very clearly.
There'll be a reminder also, like a carry out.
Yep.
Which
Like
goes
this.
inside. Okay.
Yeah. So, here's a bigger one. That's, again, we're using this, it's just, I think what I did for this one is I just stacked the other one on top of the other one. But yeah, again, we have the issue that we're having only certain weights go to certain ones, but we still have this overall structure, and we can make these as big as we want to. Obviously, it's going to become more computationally and memory-wise more of a strain to have bigger networks, but we can then do more complicated things with them. So ups and downs. So this is the information of the network. Again, the only thing we are really concerned about keeping track of, besides the structure, which is usually just written into the code, is the weights. That's what we're saving, that's what we're storing, that's what we're mutating. Usually when you save a neural network to your computer, you're just saving some file that has all the weights in it for every single layer and every single neuron. And again, just a little piece of terminology, these are going to be called layers. It's usually the layer is going to be, we can say layer referring to the neurons in the layer, but usually it's referring to the set of weights in each part of the network. All right, and remember, of course, we talked about this, these are functions. Every neuron is a function, and therefore every neural network is also a function, just a function of functions. So we can look at this neural network here. I've given these neural networks these neurons little names, F1, F2, and F3, and we can just think of this entire neural network as being the part of the function of F3, which is taking in the inputs of F1 and F2, which is just taking in the normal inputs. And you see, in a not very graphically pretty way, I did fix a mistake there. X1 and X2 is now just two inputs, but just put them in different bubbles there. But yeah, we can use these we can look at these as a function still. And again, I know I've been saying this the entire time, that's important, and we'll see why very soon. So, from the functional perspective, all a neural network is a very, very general function that's going to be mimicking some external function. Again, that can be prediction, regression, generation of any number of things. Any problem you can state as a function, as something where we're putting in inputs and we're getting some output, you can at least try to throw a neural network at it. I'm not saying it's going to do well, but you're just using these as a function mimic, basically. And it can be a lot more complicated than a purely code-driven function, or mathematical function, because we're having all of these different interactions with all these hidden layers, all these different weights that we can change to however we want them. We can do a lot with it as long as you get the right weights, as long as you can hit it thoroughly with the magic wand. So I think it's about time we finally talk about the magic wand, the secret to this kind of machine learning. You've used this magic wand before, actually. At least I hope you have, otherwise I don't know how you got through up to 252. This magic wand is known as calculus. Though this is also a bit of a lie, because the integral is not something we're going to be doing much with. Much more we're going to be working with derivatives here. So, quick little tangent before we get into the actual calculus. We need a loss function. We need, like we talked about evaluation last time, evaluation is going to be our number that we look at as humans to decide how well the neural network's doing. But the neural network also needs a way of telling how well it's doing, and that's going to be a little more specific to it. We call that the loss function, or sometimes the cost or the error. That's going to be the difference, though we're not the mathematical difference necessarily, but the difference between our output that our neural network gave, y hat, and the output that we wanted, y being this being the output of our external function we're trying to mimic, this being the output of our neural network trying to mimic that function. And we want to see how far away y is from that y hat. And again, we're going to talk so much more about loss functions later. They are their own topic entirely, but for right now, just know it's going to be this function that is going to output some number that is how far away our neural network is from being optimal. Again, cost or error sometimes. We have a lot of common ones that we use. Cross entropy is used a lot. We're going to be working with mean square error and mean absolute error sometimes. Sum of squares. I've never used hinge error or Huber error much, but you know, other options to look into. So to state our problem more precisely, we want to find a set of weights for which our loss function is minimized. That is the goal of the learning process, is to have our loss function be the minimum it can be. Well, that's where our calculus comes in. We're going to be writing the gradient of the function. As you know, by taking the derivative of a function, we can figure out which way it's going and figure out which way is down. In this case, we can look at our function and our weight there and move towards the part of our function where the loss is minimized by changing the weights. Now, this seems like a very simple, intuitive thing on this graph, but it can get a little harder when we're not working with just these two dimensions here, loss and weight, because this is just one weight. This is how changing one single weight is going to get us closer, and there's actually more efficient ways to do it if we're just using one little measly dimension, but every weight is basically its own dimension. We're working, if we have a small neural net, we're still working with dozens and dozens of dimensions here. So this multi-dimensional shape that's created by the neural network, it's a complicated matter to find which way is down, which way is minimizing our loss function, and that's where gradient descent is really useful. That, I think is it, yeah, we'll talk about next slide, but this process is called gradient descent, and it's very helpful in these very large dimensional spaces at moving towards the minimum of our loss. So yeah, gradient descent predicts the data by minimizing the loss. Learning rate, again, another subject that we're not going to cover very in depth, but there could be whole classes on learning rate. But for right now, you can think of it as a small multiplier we're going to give to our derivative, and it's going to be telling us how far we have to go down that slope at a time. And sometimes you could have neural networks where it's decreasing at times, like it'll take bigger steps early on when it's just trying to get the grasp of the problem, and then take much smaller steps to fine-tune itself later. But for right now, this little, I think that's eta, right? Yeah, I think that's Greek letter eta. But yeah, learning rate, very useful. Now, the generalizing to multiple layers is a little more complicated. Obviously, we can run this on one weight, and it's pretty easy, but we need to split up our error between the different weights of the different neurons, because we might have all the other weights are perfect, and there's just one that's really wrong. We only want to change that one weight then, heavily. So, how are we going to do that? Well, again, we can look at this as a function. The entire function is going to be the loss of the activation of the last one, and it's going to go on and on and on through each layer. And by the way, I also messed up part of this slide. Can anyone find it? it is located about here. I forgot to put the sum in, the sum sign, but yeah. Normally we would also have the sum. There's also the biases I've shown, but again, I'm just not showing that. It's in there. It's just we're not showing it in the calculation. But we have this very big function that is the entire neural network, as well as the loss function. So when we have functions of functions and we want to find the gradient inside them, we can use the chain rule. The chain rule lets us, if we have a function f of g, and g is a function of x, then we can find the derivative of f with respect to x by just finding derivative of f with respect to g and the derivative of g with respect to x, and we are golden. Basically, what gradient descent is, in the end of the day, is just using the chain rule. Lots and lots of the chain rule over the entirety of the neural network to find what part of the error comes from what part of the network. So, and that is also why when we have an activation function, we definitely want it to have a nice slope where we can derive it at any point, because we're going to have to be deriving it. That's part of this function, is the activation. So to find the loss overall, we're going to be taking the derivative of each part of the function, and we multiply the value of the end derivative we're taking. We find the error, we use the chain rule to find something called the delta, which is going to be our derivative we got wrong. And finally, we multiply that by our learning rate to get a adjustment. The adjustment is just added on to all the weights, and we're golden. We have moved the weights slightly into a better position, and we'll do that over and over and over again. So, got another video here. What's our time constraint? We got 10 minutes left. Yeah. I'm going to skip the first part of this video, but it's a good video, and I think definitely give it a watch later if you want. It's just another kind of look at the same thing we talked about here. And oops. This guy's got other good neural network videos too if you want.
Back-propagation.
We did not do that.
Here, we get a little bit more formal on guided networks, which have sensitive because each layer has a single neural engine. For those of you uncomfortable with the relevant calculus,
We'll start there.
I do have a whole series on the topic. Let's just start off with an extremely simple network, one where each layer has a single neuron in it. So this particular network is determined by 3 weights and 3 biases. Our goal is to understand how sensitive the cost function is to these variables. That way we know which adjustments to those terms is going to cause the most efficient decrease to the cost function. And we're just going to focus on the connection between the last 2 neurons. Let's label the activation.
Real quick, so again, if he's saying that we're changing the bias, that is another way of looking at it, but the way that it's best, I think, to think about it is we aren't changing the bias, we're changing the weight to the bias. The bias is always going to be 1, but we're just deciding what proportion of 1 that is, whether it's 2 times 1 and we're getting a bigger bias, or 0.1 times 1 and we're getting a tiny bias. Yeah.
Of that last neuron with a superscript L indicating which layer it's in. So the activation of the previous neuron is a L minus 1. These are not exponents, they're just a way of indexing what we're talking about, since I want to save subscripts for different indices later on. Now let's say that the value we want this last activation to be for a given training example is y. For example, y might be 0 or 1. So the cost of this simple network for a single training example is AL minus y squared. We'll denote the cost of that one training example as C0. As a reminder, this last activation is determined by a weight, which which I'm going to call WL, times the previous neuron's activation plus some bias, which I'll call BL. And then you pump that through some special nonlinear function like the sigmoid or a radian. It's actually going to make things easier for us if we give a special name to this weighted sum, like Z, with the same superscript as the relevant activations. So this is a lot of terms, and a way that you might conceptualize it is that the weight, the previous action, and the bias all together are used to compute Z, which in turn lets us compute A, which finally, along with the constant Y, lets us compute the cost. And of course, AL minus 1 is influenced by its own weight and bias and such. But we're not going to focus on that right now. Now, all of these are just numbers, right? And it can be nice to think of each one as having its own little number line. Our first goal is to understand how sensitive the cost function is to small changes in our weight, WL. Or phrased differently, what is the derivative of C with respect to WL? When you see this del W term, think of it as meaning some tiny nudge to W, like a change by 0.01. And think of this del C term as meaning whatever the resulting nudge to the cost is. What we want is their ratio. Conceptually, this tiny nudge to WL causes some nudge to ZL, which in turn causes some nudge to AL, which directly influences the cost. So we break things up by first looking at the ratio of a tiny change to ZL to this tiny change W. That is the derivative of ZL with respect to WL. Likewise, you then consider the ratio of the change to AL to the tiny change in ZL that caused it, as well as the ratio between the final nudge to C and this intermediate nudge to AL. This right here is the chain rule, where multiplying together these three ratios gives us the sensitivity of C to small changes in WL. So on screen right now, there's kind of a lot of symbols, and take a moment to just make sure it's clear what they all are. Because now we're going to compute the relevant derivatives. The derivative of C with respect to AL works out to be 2 times AL minus Y. Notice, this means that its size is proportional to the difference between the network's output and the thing that we want it to be. So if that output was very different, even slight changes stand to have a big impact on the final cost function. The derivative of AL with respect to ZL is just the derivative of our sigmoid function, or whatever nonlinearity you choose to use. And the derivative of ZL with respect to WL, in this case, comes out just to be AL minus 1. Now, I don't know about you, but I think it's easy to get stuck head down in the formulas without taking a moment to sit back and remind yourself of what they all actually mean. In the case of this last derivative, the amount that that small nudge to the weight influenced the last layer depends on how strong the previous neuron is. Remember, this is where that neurons that fire together, wire together idea comes in. And all of this is the derivative with respect to WL only of the cost for a specific single training example. Since the full cost function involves averaging together all those costs across many different training examples, its derivative requires averaging this expression that we found over all training examples.
So real quick, another, just look at this. Again, we have the chain rule here. We are computing these extra derivatives mainly because we want these to cancel, our z's to cancel out, our a's to cancel out, so we're left with a nice pure cost as a function of our weights for each specific layer. We'll do a little bit more of this
And of course,
video
that
before I
is
cut
just
it.
one component of the gradient function, which itself is built up from the partial derivatives of the cost function with respect to all those weights and biases. But even though that's just one of the many partial derivatives we need, it's more than 50% of the work. The sensitivity to the bias, for example, is almost identical. We just need to change out this del Z del W term for a del Z del B.
Again, if you have the bias as a weight, the nice thing is you don't have
If
to
you
do
look at
that
the
because it's
formula,
just
that
changing
number
another
comes
weight.
out to be 1. Also, and this is where the idea of propagating backwards comes in, you can see how sensitive this cost function is to the activation of the previous layer. Namely, this initial derivative in the chain rule expression, the sensitivity of Z to the previous activation comes out it's helpful to keep track of, because now we can just keep iterating this same chain rule idea backwards to see how sensitive the cost function is to previous weights and previous biases. And you might think that
I'm going to cut it there. Definitely watch, this is on the slides and it's on the links for the slides, so definitely watch this again later if you want to take another look at it. But that's just the basic idea here. We're just using the chain rule on every part of this neural network that we're treating as a function, and we're using that to compute an adjustment that we can use to adjust the weights, and that in its entirety is the magic wand idea we were working with. So, quick example here just to go through this. We have our little neural network. It is actually structurally right this time, so that's good. Input layer, hidden layer, output layer. 2 inputs, 1 output, and 3 hidden neurons. Our loss is going to be this MSE. Our activation is going to be something just called f of x, and our activation's derivative is f prime of x. We have our weights as these matrices here. We'll talk more at a later lecture why it's nice to keep these as a sort of matrix instead of coding it in a more structural way. But for right now, just know we have our weights for the second layer, weights for the first layer, and it can correspond to which neuron. By the way, you will also notice if we're saying this corresponds to 1 neuron, right? The weights for 1 neuron in the next layer, and because we have our 3 hidden neurons, why are we putting this one the other way? Why is this one not flipped? Well, the answer is it should be. The reason I have it this way is once we start working with this, we will be doing transpositions to make it a little easier for mathematically. But you can also consider this is the weight from, this is going to be the weight from one of our, actually it would kind of work out anyways, but yeah. It's the 1 input, 1 input, 1 input for our second layer, and 1 input, 1 input for our last layer, and these would be the neurons it's going to. So we actually do our back propagation here. It's a fairly simple algorithm. Given our learning rate, our layer 1 out, layer 2 out, and remember, we're getting these from our forward propagation. Our loss function and all of our other functions and x's and y's there. All we're doing here is we're calculating the layer 2 error, which is of course our loss, which in this case is y minus L2 out. Or technically it's our loss derivative, because again we're working with derivatives here. We calculate the delta for that layer using our error. We calculate our error for the last layer, and again you can do this for however many layers you have. By the way, you see a dot instead of a star here. That is going to be our dot product, because if you think about it, when we're representing this as matrices, we can do the whole sum and product operation just with a dot product. It's a lot easier way to do that. But we go through, we get our errors, we get our deltas, we get our adjustments by multiplying the inputs from the layer times the deltas, or dot product them with the deltas, and then multiply that entire thing by our learning rate. That gives us our adjustments, and we can use that to adjust our weights and get them closer to minimizing the cost function. So, summary of the whole process: run a forward pass, calculate the loss, calculate the delta, do that for every single layer, get the adjustments at the end, multiply by the learning rate to get the actual adjustments, and do that use that to adjust the weights, and then do that for every batch of data, batch of our input. We'll talk a little more about mini batches later. And for every epoch, we're going to be doing this lots and lots of times, running the same data through it, so it can get closer and closer to hitting that perfect amount, that perfect optimization of the loss. And that's about it for today as far as the subject. Homework, pretty simple. I'm giving you a neural network, I'm giving you a loss function, I'm giving you an activation. I want you to print that out and by hand go through and run a forward pass, write down some information, and run a backward pass and write down the new weights. It's a really simple network, so it shouldn't be that hard to do. It's kind of tedious, but it should give you a lot more, a more intimate look into how it works internally, because you'll be doing every calculation by hand and be able to see what we want the computer to do once we actually start implementing this for our first project. Again, seriously, don't worry about the grade. It's not a big deal. But if you have any questions, if you're having trouble with it, just email me. We'll figure it out. A couple links, including the 3 Blue 1 Brown video. Watch that if you want to get a little closer look into it. And we're done. Homework's due next week, and we also have another assigned video up on the site. Peace. Okay.